This guard captivated fans with his on-court swagger and dominant scoring ability, but whatever happened to one of college basketball's biggest villains, Marshall Henderson? Marshall Henderson grew up in Hurst, Texas, playing under his dad, Willie, and during high school, Henderson was one of the best players in the entire state of Texas. In his senior year, he'd averaged 25, 5, and 5, and was ranked as the 57th best point guard in the class of 2009. However, Marshall would have several brushes with trouble during this time. In the spring of his senior year, Henderson and a friend would be arrested for trying to purchase marijuana with $800 of counterfeit money. But this didn't stop the talented guard from being heavily recruited. Marshall would turn down offers from schools such as Gonzaga and Notre Dame to commit to the University of Utah. And it did not take long for Marshall to make an impact on the Utes. In his freshman season, he'd finish second on the team in scoring, averaging 11.8 points per game. However, there would be several problematic incidents during the season that would help shape Marshall as the villain. For example, in January of 2010, he'd be suspended for throwing a punch at an opposing player in a game against BYU. And following that season, Henderson announced he'd be leaving the University of Utah. He cited issues with head coach Jim Boylan, claiming that Boylan's restrictions directly conflicted with his individualism. Marshall would transfer to Texas Tech, with the primary reason being the head coach there, Pat Knight. But due to transfer rules, Henderson was forced to sit out an entire season. Following that season, however, Knight was fired. With Pat no longer there, Henderson once again entered the transfer portal, leaving Texas Tech before even playing a single game there. Henderson would spend the 2011-2012 season with South Plains College, a JUCO in Texas. During the season, Marshall was absolutely stellar. He won the NJCAA Player of the Year while leading South Plains to a JUCO national championship. But Marshall's high school legal troubles would come back to haunt him. Henderson was retroactively put on a 2-year probation starting in June of 2010, and just months before he was set to get off probation, he tested positive for marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, which of course was a direct violation of his probation. He'd be sentenced to 4 months in prison, but ultimately spend just 25 days there. And despite the off-court issues, D1 coaches saw Henderson as simply too talented to pass up on. He would transfer for the 3rd time in the spring of 2012, this time to Ole Miss. Almost immediately, Henderson took on a role as the leader and the star player of the team. He would average 20 points per game and lead the Rebels to an SEC title. But beyond the scoring abilities of Henderson, it was his on-court swagger that made him must-watch TV. I mean, he would carry himself with an otherworldly amount of swagger, and was seemingly always pulling off some crazy antics. Whether it was trash-talking coaches or throwing ice at Kentucky fans, Ole Miss fans loved him, and the rest of the country loved to hate him. I mean, this guy hung 21 points on Florida in the SEC championship, and then started gator chomping around the stadium. Henderson would be named the SEC Newcomer of the Year, but after only making the conference's 2nd team, he would go on to call the league's coaches losers. In the NCAA tournament, Henderson would will his team to an upset win over Wisconsin in the 1st round. And despite a loss in the round of 32, Marshall would make even bigger headlines when he celebrated a 3 by pretending to smoke a joint. And following the game, Henderson would be seen kicking water bottles and flipping off the crowd. Marshall would return for one more season, but the Rebels failed to make the NCAA tournament. As Henderson's collegiate career came to a close, he would go undrafted in 2014, but would embark overseas, where he would see his basketball career jump around the world from Italy to Qatar to Iran. And after a brief stint in the G League, Marshall's playing career would come to a close in 2017. In the years since, Marshall has spent time as a high school coach, and even returned to Ole Miss in 2020 as a graduate manager. And currently, Henderson works as an assistant coach at Independence Community College in Independence, Kansas. Henderson's impact on college basketball was brief and perhaps forgettable for those that did not get to see him play. But for many of us, he'll be remembered as one of the best villains in college basketball history.